around. Good morning and good evening, everyone. Welcome to Humane Society International and International Finance Corporation webinar, Integrated Animal Welfare into Financing. My name is Hang Lee, and I'm the Farm Animal Welfare Manager for Southeast Asia, Humane Society International. I'm happy to say that it's our first co-hosting webinar with IFC. And the webinar is aimed at showing how important farm animal welfare is for financial institutions. There are two speaker presentations, and then the Q&A will be followed. If you have a question for our speakers, do not wait until the Q&A. Please leave them in the Q&A box. With that, please allow me to introduce our first speaker today, Jackie Grobeski. Jackie, can you have your camera open so people can see you? Jackie is Senior Program Manager for Corporate Financial Institution Engagement for Humane Societies, Farm Animal Welfare and Protection Programs. She advocates for the adoption of high animal welfare standards within financial institution policies, practices, procedures, as well as within corporate supply chains around the world. For today's session, Jackie will discuss how animal welfare aligns with global ESG and sustainability efforts, as well as primary farm animal welfare risks, and what financial institutions can do to support stronger animal welfare practices. Jackie, can you have your slide share? Yes. Floor is yours, Jackie.
Thank you so much, Hung, and thank you for everybody who's joining today and everybody who will watch this in the future. Today we're going to talk about integrating animal welfare into financing. And unfortunately, this is a very important topic just because animal welfare is often ignored and not properly addressed by financial institutions within their policies and procedures. This webinar is a call to action to financial institutions and investors around the world. Please include animal welfare in your policies, practices, and procedures. It's not only the right thing to do, but it can also lower risk and potentially increase return. So a little bit about...
Sorry, Jackie, there is a request from Ari to record the web. Yeah, thank you.
No worries. A little bit more about Humane Society International. We are one of the largest animal welfare nonprofit organizations in the world, and we confront animal cruelty in all of its forms in over 50 countries. Internally, we have several different departments organized generally by animal welfare issue. And as Hung mentioned, I work in the Farm Animal Welfare Department, and I oversee our global financial institution engagement. A little bit more about my team. We have two primary work streams. One, improve the welfare of animals in production, which is primarily what we're going to be addressing today. And then two, reducing the number of animals in production. We work with a wide variety of stakeholder groups. Of course, financial institutions is one of them. We also work with corporations and producers to improve animal welfare. We don't just ask you to change, we work with you to change. For example, Hung, my colleague who introduced me, has actually been on farm providing technical support to producers in Vietnam. So we want to be that partner for you and we want to work with you, which is why I am so grateful that we get to work with IFC on this co-hosted event, just because collaboration is extremely important. We might not see eye to eye on everything, of course, that happens with several other groups that we work with, but it's still important to have these discussions and to continue progress because both IFC and HSI agree that animals are suffering in our global food system. And we also agree that financial institutions can play a pivotal role in reducing that suffering. If you're currently referencing IFC practices and standards, animal welfare is something you need to be looking at. I wanted to briefly mention the FARMS Initiative. The FARMS Initiative is a coalition between Humane Society International, Compassion in World Farming, and World Animal Protection that was created to engage with and support global financial institutions. We created responsible minimum standards for 6 different species. These standards outline how farm animals should be raised, transported, and slaughtered. They're very specific guidelines. We will also be launching an RMS for the protein shift within the next couple months. We ask financial institutions to reference the RMS in their public-facing policies and also use the RMS in due diligence. A little bit more about animal welfare. Animal welfare is the physical and mental state of an animal in relation to the conditions in which it lives and dies. Animal welfare is on a continuum from poor to good. Animals in a good state of welfare are healthy, comfortable, and have what they need, while animals on the other end of the spectrum may be suffering, dealing with pain, fear, or distress. As you can imagine, there are many different animal welfare issues and risks, which you see in the bullet points below. Today, we're going to focus, and primarily what we'll focus on are those 2 first bullet points: barren and unsuitable environments, and space limitations and overcrowding. Poor animal welfare is a risk along the entire supply chain. We've met with many different financial institutions who tell us repeatedly, well, we don't invest directly in farms, or we don't finance farms directly. That doesn't matter. If you finance or invest in any companies that have animal products anywhere in their supply chain, animal welfare is important. A good example on the animal procurement and production end, or animal procurement side of things, is companies like Marriott. We've actually worked with Marriott globally to approach their suppliers and have discussions about how they can improve animal welfare on farm. So with all those issues, how do we pick what to focus on? Well, when we're looking at all the issues, we think about what is causing the most suffering, which animals are suffering the most, and the degree to which they suffer. Going through that analysis brought us to cages for egg-laying hens and crates for gestating sows or mother pigs. These production systems were created many years ago in an attempt to simplify production with absolutely zero regard for animal welfare. These practices align with a lot of sustainable intensification strategies. They wanted to produce more with less. Cages and crates prevent animals from expressing nearly all of their natural behaviors. For example, they can't turn around or comfortably lie down. A battery cage is smaller than the size of a piece of paper. Thankfully, there are alternative systems that exist that are significantly better for animal welfare, such as group housing, which you'll hear about a little bit later. Regarding capital costs and costs overall, higher welfare systems can cost more in some cases, but they can also cost less. It just depends on the system. Margins can be improved because of potential productivity enhancements and willingness of customers to pay more for higher welfare products. There's also research showing that higher welfare systems can at the very least maintain production levels. As with any new system, whether it be a new car manufacturing facility or a pig production facility, management is essential. Some of the things I wanted to highlight regarding the business case for animal welfare, starting with regulatory and legal risk. Regulations around the world are requiring higher welfare systems, for example, banning cages and crates. In some countries, these changes may not happen for 20 or 30 years, but it is still very applicable to financial institutions because of the depreciable life of animal production equipment. While some global regulations are improving, many others are far behind, and Yvonne will discuss that more in a little bit detail, and discuss that in more detail in a little bit. Loss of market access is another consideration that ties to regulatory risk. So changing consumer preferences, changing procurement practices, and regulations can limit market access for companies that refuse to transition. And we've seen this happening already. For example, Proposition 12 in California in the United States. There are other financial considerations associated with poor welfare systems, such as stranded assets if equipment needs to be replaced before its depreciable life has ended. Animal welfare and sustainability. Animal welfare aligns very well with sustainability and ESG, even though we've seen it left out of the conversation time and time again. That's because, not only are companies thinking about making money, but they're also thinking about their impact on the world. It makes sense that we wouldn't want to put companies and regions, or especially emerging economies, into systems that are being phased out in other parts of the world. That doesn't make sense. If these systems have already proven to be unsustainable in other regions, why would we encourage that? It's just unsustainable over the long term. If we had to pick a pillar of ESG that animal welfare fit under, we would pick the S pillar, social. Primarily because animal welfare can be a very moral issue. The way that we treat animals is just completely unacceptable in our food systems today. Additionally, consumer demand, public procurement, etc. When we talk about environmental considerations, a lot of the focus is primarily related to the protein shift or plant-based work that we do. It's more about the reduction in number of animals, not necessarily improving animal welfare within housing equipment, for example. And it's not just me saying this. There are global standards that are mentioning animal welfare and how it aligns with ESG and sustainability. For example, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct. They recently included animal welfare for the very first time in 2023. Sector standards for SASB and GRI specifically mention animal welfare as a material risk, and also mention confinement and ask companies to report on the use of systems like cages and crates. Principles for responsible banking and principles for sustainable insurance also reference the Farms Initiative RMS, and this is just a subset of standards that include animal welfare. So what can financial institutions do, and how can we help? HSI works very closely with financial institutions around the world. We can provide specific policy recommendations. So instead of just telling you what to do, we actually help you look at your current policies and figure out how animal welfare can fit in. We can also provide due diligence support, active engagement support, education and training, and of course, connecting you with producers and companies that are looking for financing. Because we have such close relationships with some of these companies and producers, we know for a fact that financing is often a challenge. So what can financial institutions do? Please include animal welfare in your policies, practices, and procedures. Our main ask today is that you incorporate it into public-facing policies in a meaningful way. Some other examples would be creating an exclusion list, incorporating animal welfare into due diligence or investment agreements, actively engaging with current companies that you're financing or investing in, supporting policy efforts to improve animal welfare, or creating special financing structures. I wanted to briefly show an example of a financial institution that has an animal welfare policy. Standard Chartered is one of many examples. As you can see, they do specifically state that they will not finance cages or crates. And they also mention that they will not finance production, manufacture, or trade of fur or exotic leather. And then they also encourage clients to adhere to the responsible minimum standards issued by the Farms Initiative. So just one example out of many where they're being very specific about what they allow and don't allow. A lot of times we see companies reference the 5 freedoms. And while the 5 freedoms sound great, like allowing animals to express their natural behavior or have freedom from distress, we often see companies reference that, but still use cages and crates. So those two things can't exist at the same time. It's best if you're referencing the 5 freedoms to please be specific in what you will allow and not allow. And that's how we can help. I wanted to just show a couple financing examples. I'm not going to go through each of them, but we have really had some success working with financial institutions on creating innovative financing structures to include animal welfare or be made specifically for animal welfare. One that I wanted to mention was Agrobank in Malaysia. Agrobank was able to give a loan to an egg producer to build the country's very first cage-free aviary. And this was below market financing, and they were able to offer this financing because of a government initiative looking to improve technology and sustainability in agriculture. And they were able to prove that this new aviary does align with better technology and more sustainable agriculture. This will be the first time in Malaysia that financing under this branch of financing has been used to improve animal welfare. So great improvement and lots of amazing things happening around the world. So to summarize, strong animal welfare can reduce risk and potentially increase return. So why not have the conversation? Take the next steps and let us help you. HSI working with us is completely free. And just having a meeting with us and having a conversation doesn't mean that you need to commit to anything. Let's talk about what the challenges are. Let's talk about how we can help and then determine next steps. And with that, I will hand it back to our lovely moderator, Hung. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jackie, for a very powerful presentation and highlighting the animal welfare risks and how financial institutions can support animal welfare with the support from SSI, of course. So our next speaker, let me bring our next speaker is a representative from IFC, Mr. Ivan Ivanov. Ivan is the IFC Global Lead for Sustainable Protein Advisory Service, where he oversees all technical assistance for IFC animal protein client, a portfolio over $1 billion. Ivan has more than 25 years of experience setting up, managing, investing in, and advising private businesses. In IFC, he has worked at the country head, regional advisory manager, and global business advisory league. Prior to IFC, he has managed several successful private ventures in distribution and food processing in Eastern Europe. Today, Ivan will discuss how animal welfare is an integral part of IFC performance standard and the way IFC implements it reflected in IFC practices for sustainable investment in livestock. Ivan, are you ready? You can have your slide share.
Thank you, Han. Yep. It's a pleasure to be on this joint event, and thank you to everybody that joined online and also those that will be listening to the recording. So let me share my screen and we launch the presentation.
Yes,
okay.
Yep, perfect now,
Good.
Ivan. Thank you.
So I will start with a very short introduction of what IFC is, because for some of you, this may be a new institution. So we're part of the World Bank Group, and we're the part that works with private sector. So there are 5 other bodies there, and the World Bank itself, which is called technically IBRD, works with governments. Now, we have been set in 56. We're the first multilateral developmental bank that works with private sector. Many more has been created over the years. We tend to think about ourselves as the institution that sets standards. Here is a little bit of our history. So just a couple of things. So we actually coined the term emerging markets. We started investing in what today is called emerging markets in the late 70s, early 80s, when nobody was doing this. We think we are the one that the financial institution that has created the framework of what sustainability is for financial institutions. So in 2000, we launched our performance standards, and shortly afterwards, we created what is called the Equator Principles. So for those of you that are part of financial institutions, most probably your bank is part of the Equator Principles, which actually refers to the IFC performance standards. Now, we are a developmental institution with a developmental goal to further development in the low-income countries of the world, but we are also a bank that is for profit. And that's very important to state in this discussion, because we will discuss the issue of animal welfare through the view of a developmental institution that works for profit. It's not just for good causes. So here you can see where we invest, and as you can see, half of our exposure is to banks. This is actually how we reach the smaller companies in those countries. And then the rest is direct investments in companies. And we'll be talking about the agribusiness, which represents roughly 6-7% of our exposure. Globally, if you look at where agribusiness exposure is in our portfolio, you'll see that Asia, if you take Asia together, East Asia and South Asia, is the largest agribusiness exposure with close to 32%. Latin America is big, Africa is big, and Europe, which is predominantly Eastern Europe, is getting down. Now, in the agribusiness space, we invest, among other things, in protein, and we call it sustainable protein. And I'll talk more about this because we think we invest in the protein sector, and the protein sector includes dairy, meat production, aquaculture, and alternative protein. And we invest in this sector through a lens that takes in consideration everything that is related to the sustainability of the sector. So we have an exposure of $1 billion currently, with dairy, pork, and poultry taking the biggest chunk of our portfolio. Now, here's what we think is the sustainability framework for the livestock companies, and this is what we require from our investees. Now, this is part of our performance standards. So on any investment, we apply the performance standards, which is the framework of what we define as sustainability. But for specifically the livestock sector in 2022, we came with a set of practices, and they're publicly available, where we talk about 7 of the areas that we think are the most important for those companies. So it's the biosecurity, it's the responsible and prudent use of antimicrobials, it's animal welfare that we'll delve in further. It's a decarbonization pathway in the operations of the companies. It's prevention of loss of biodiversity, producing safe food, and applying the local regulations. Now, let's talk about animal welfare into some more details. So we care about the 5 freedoms in a very, very specific way. And as Jackie was saying, we have interpreted this into our performance standards and then further into the practices. But when it comes to what this means for a company, we refer to acceptable to us and reputable global, regional, national standards that actually encompass all those things. So there has to be a husbandry management system in those companies that includes animal welfare, because animal welfare comes at every stage of the life of an animal. And we will talk a little bit more about some of the animal welfare aspects, but we care about all of it. That's why what we require from our companies is to certify or verify their systems against the standard that we accept. Now, very often we refer to what used to be global gap for livestock, which basically is a reflection of the European Union legislation, and it is a very requiring high standard for both a husbandry system and specifically for animal welfare practices. And we have, in addition to this, an exclusion list where we don't accept certain practices like production for fur, like force feeding, and also caged animals specifically for layer production and pregnant sows. So we will talk a little bit more here about group housing, which is a system that is applied to pregnant sows in pork production. And the reason we'll be talking about this is that, as you can see from where we invest in Asia. And if you think about pork production happens predominantly in Asia, because probably some 60% of all the production is concentrated in Asia. And here are the biggest producers in the world, like China. Vietnam is a very large producer. Thailand is a very large producer. So we care about what the systems are in those countries. And very importantly, group housing is non-existent. So let's start with this. So let's talk a little bit what group housing is. As Jackie was saying, it is a system that provides more freedom for movement. So on the right side, you can see a very small picture in the top with the crates. That's the traditional system that's applied in the bulk of the US production, in all of Asian production, and that has been phased out in the European Union. Now, group housing are the other two pictures where pregnant sows have the freedom to move and they can express their natural behavior. Now, while this is very good for the animals, from a point of view of behavior, actually, it creates a little bit more. I mean, they have to establish the order of the pack, so it creates tension in the group. It can result in injury. It can also deprive some of the individuals in this group from feeding if you don't provide the proper system for this. So from a point of view of a producer, that's a completely different system. Now, we are very careful when we adopt any requirement because it has to be first based on science. So for this one, we have first looked at the science, then we have looked at the predominant practice, and we have looked at whether this is practically possible without adverse effect to the production system. Because let's also be very clear, our first mandate is to fight poverty and to provide affordable food. And then we have to do this sustainably. But the first priority is food. So, so if the consumers in those countries consume pork meat, then we have to look at how we can do this in a sustainable way, but still we don't want to affect the availability of the product. So we have looked at the history of those regions that have transitioned. So here you can see the European Union, and there is a graph also on the performance of the United States. And you can see that over the transition period that was between 2000 2020, there was no adverse effect on the productivity of the herd in the European Union. Now, we also look at, say, group housing, what exactly this means for a producer. And we look at this because we want to be sure that if we require somebody in our portfolio to transition, this is feasible and we know all the risks. And if there are some significant risks, we may also want to help our clients. So if we look at the cost of the transition, this is the left graph, and that's just an estimate. Estimates can vary, but basically some of the systems, which are very simple, are much cheaper than the existing systems in terms of capex. They may be actually, they are much more demanding in terms of management, and then operational costs may be higher. And then you have systems that use technology or provide more space or provide more facilities which take care of all the production issues that the producers cares about, and they're more expensive in terms of capex. So we choose, well, we let our clients to choose the system they feel more comfortable with, but basically if we require them to transition, and we do require all of them that have a different system from the system that is in our performance standards, as I described them. In this case, if it is group housing, we would require them to transition to the system, and we give them a transition period. And we do this because it's a completely different system. They have to get comfortable with it. They have to choose which system. They have to build the internal capacity to manage the system. They have to be confident that they can manage it. And only then they will do it. And only then what we do will have any effect on the market. And that's an important point, because we don't finance all the companies on the market. Say in Vietnam, we have 3 clients in the pork sector. We don't work with everybody in the sector, but we think we have some of the best performers in the sector. Now, if they transition to the system, this will be a very, very strong system, signal to the system as a whole, and this is what we're looking for. Now, when we talk to our clients, and as part of the discussion with them, we also bring the experience that we have for the last more than 10 years on this topic. So we have clients, and those long-term clients in countries like Ukraine. Here's an example from Ukraine, a company there that has some 12 pig farms. They're one of the most advanced pork producers in the country, and they have fully transitioned to group housing. And then we discussed with them the performance before and after, the risks, the challenges that they had, and whether they would even think to go back. Now, it is very clear that the current group housing system performs in terms of KPIs at the same level as the previous system, but it also provides some better health outcomes that in this case were a little bit difficult to quantify, but the client clearly said we'll never go back to the old system. We're very comfortable with this system. Animals are very happy, and we want to continue this way. We have also a client in China that has gone through the same transition, and they report that they have 2% better health outcomes. So and close to 1% reduction in stillbirths, which is another indicator where you can look at the performance of pregnancies and you can say this is a better system. Now, I want to talk also about another aspects of what we do, and it's an important part because we're in this developmental work, and we look at everything that can contribute to the development. Now, as I said, in the countries where we work, laws and regulations not necessarily are up to what we define as sustainability. Now, that's why we look at specific issues in some of the countries. We, as you can see on this slide, we require clients to obey to national regulation. Actually, any of the financial institutions that's on this call requires the same. Now, but we also want those national regulations to be the best that can be there in terms of addressing the sustainability issues, and also to be clear so that they can be applied. If possible, we also require, well, we don't require, we wish that there is sufficient capacity in the host countries to actually implement those regulations and help operators apply them. So we have a separate line of business which is advisory to governments, and we look at certain issues like animal welfare and antibiotics. I want to give you an example for Vietnam. So we looked at the regulation in Vietnam for those 2 issues. We applied what we believe is the best standards in regulations, addressing all the requirements of the WOHA, or OIE as used to be called, terrestrial code, which is where all the requirements for animal welfare are housed. And then I don't expect you to look at all those boxes, but the important column here is addressed, and those are the requirements in the terrestrial code on animal welfare. So you can see that of all the requirements, only 2 are addressed. Few are partially addressed, and most are not addressed at all. So the bottom line of the legislation in Vietnam on animal welfare is that it's largely lacking any guidance, let alone guidance on group housing. So we are engaging with the government of Vietnam to see whether there is an interest and willingness to work on those issues. If it is so, we will be very glad to help the government strengthen this regulation. And if anybody on this call is interested or willing to participate in this, please contact me after the webinar. With this, I like to share the QR code of the practices for sustainable investment in livestock, which is what I presented at the beginning, which is the framework under which we invest in the livestock sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Now we will have a Q&A session. Jackie, can you have your camera opened? And okay, thank you. Ivan, I guess the first question I will, it will be for you. It's very interesting that IFC also doing some scanning on the regulations and policy in terms of animal welfare. So I really want to have a follow-up questions on that. So you mentioned, of course, in some of the countries, for example, like Vietnam, you just mentioned, where IFC operates the policy and regulation about animal welfare are well behind the standards you require and you wish they will. So what are the challenges and opportunities that being presented in such situations?
Okay, let's be clear. I presented Vietnam because we have Vietnamese audience here, because I'm present in Vietnam. Actually, I'm based in Vietnam. And we have big exposure to the livestock sector here. We're very interested in the development of Vietnam. So that's the reason this is one of the 4 countries where we've done this. So we have done this also in Ukraine, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and we're doing a 4th country now. So now I can tell you that out of the 190 countries in the world, most probably based on our current experience, probably 160 or 70 don't address those issues. So Vietnam is not unique. Vietnam probably is what the norm is. Still, I believe that in some countries, gradually, governments will get engaged. So our theory is changes that, and this is actually what we have seen in other markets, is that a lot of the regulatory requirements get adopted by the champions in the industry as a voluntary standard, for the reasons that Jackie already mentioned in her presentation. And as this become an accepted norm in the country, at one point of time, this gets legislated and regulated in bigger detail. And there is the interest from the industry and the government to regulate the issue. In many of the countries where we work, this is a very new topic, and there is willingness in principle, but very little capacity and ability to actually do something. So we also have to be practical on how far we can expect those countries to move in terms of regulation and what we'll get out of this. Because also we don't want a law that is out there on a shelf and then there is zero implementation. So that's certainly not the thing we want.
I completely agree. Implementation is very important. So the next question for you, Jackie, you mentioned that several financial institutions don't include animal welfare in their policy and practices yet. Why do you think that this? And do you face pushback?
Great question. So why do we see pushback and why do financial institutions not include animal welfare? So honestly, as an animal welfare organization, as many of you could imagine, we struggle to even get meetings. A lot of times we don't have the contacts or we're not able to get in touch with the right people. Other times we have meetings and they listen to us very nicely and then they say, we're not interested, have a good day. Which is why it's so important to financial institutions hear this from IFC and from other financial institutions that this is important. It's not just the animal welfare people that are saying this, it's also their peers. I think the apprehension is a mix of several things. Unfortunately, and I hate to say it, but I think some financial institutions simply don't care. They don't care that their activities are causing an immense amount of suffering for billions of animals. If we include farmed fish, that's trillions. Other financial institutions are concerned about rocking the boat or taking a chance on something that they're not familiar with. So that causes them to be concerned about implementing change. But that's where we come in, of course. Others focus on costs, and up until recently, there hasn't been much research on the costs of these things. Or if there has been research, it's been created by the industry against trying to improve welfare. So I think there's a lot of factors, but it just comes down to, this has happened in other sustainability areas, right? So human rights, environmental, fossil fuels, etc. And all of those areas still need significant improvement, by the way. But, animal welfare is just kind of in the beginning stages of financial institutions and companies really taking this seriously and understanding the material risks of ignoring it.
Thank you for sharing. I completely agree. Like 5 years ago, when I just started working on the animal welfare movement in Southeast Asia, there was not much, but it is improved now. So I'm seeing that financial institutions want to start include animal welfare in their policy. So with that, I have a next question for both of you. For example, if a financial institution wants to start incorporating animal welfare best practices more in the way they structure investment, so what would be the first steps? Ivan, you want to go first?
Well, I mean, the first one is, of course, to understand the issue, and then to decide on their policy. And I want just to comment on what Jackie said. I mean, we have 1,000 banking clients. Those are the largest banks in all the countries where we operate. We have 7 clients here in Vietnam, which are the largest private banks, banks in Vietnam. We work only with private banks. Now, our clients actually are pretty responsible, not pretty, they are very responsible institutions, and they care about sustainability. They apply our performance standards. Having said that, which is to say that a lot of the financial institutions do care about those things, there are a lot of aspects of sustainability. Yeah? And if the financial institution has a very narrow exposure to some types of lending products in some groups, say they lend here just in Ho Chi Minh City, then they have no exposure to animal welfare. So direct, to farm production. So I would say they probably don't care because they don't see it in their portfolio. Others actually have pretty clear views on this, and I'll use probably the name that comes very often when you talk about agribusiness lending, Rabobank. they do have policies. They do have an approach to this. So first is the institution should understand their proper exposure risks and so on, and then take a position on the policy, and most importantly on how they implement this policy. So that's how it has to be done, I guess.
I totally agree with Yvonne. I think, of course, there are groups that care about this, and some of them don't see animal welfare. You know, they're not going on farm necessarily or going directly to producers, or like I mentioned, some of them are focused on hospitality or, you know, food manufacturing, where it's more of a procurement related issue, so they don't quite see it. We've also worked with several financial institutions who outsource due diligence, and if the companies that they're paying to handle due diligence don't look at animal welfare, that's another way that it also gets kind of ignored. Among many issues, we recognize like there's a billion sustainability issues, so we understand. We just want animal welfare to be part of it. I think step one, exactly like Yvonne said, understand the issue, and that's where HSI comes in. So we can support that for free and come in and teach you about the key issues. Then I think financial institutions have to find a way to assess internally their exposure to these things, because like we said, you might think, oh, well, I'm not financing farms directly, or I'm not investing in farms directly, but do you have any other companies or exposure to companies that use animal products in any capacity? And do they have that information? Can they get that information easily? Then next, I think, you know, it's having discussions with us or internally or with another group with support of IFC or others. How can we actually influence this? If you're an investor, depending on the structure, you might be limited in the access that you have to the companies that you're investing in. You can't call up the CEO necessarily and ask him to provide the procurement standards. So figure out the issues, figure out exposure, and then figure out how they can actually influence given the structures that they have. And sometimes just a little push really makes a big difference. So I think, you know, it's just getting it started.
Thank you, Jackie and Ivan. It's a huge work for financial institutions like IFC and the way that Humane Society International working to support. And Jackie, I want to follow up on that. If financial institutions start to include the animal welfare within their policy, so do you know if is there any specific benchmarks on farm animal welfare that financial institutions can use when they invest in their clients?
Great question. So the question is about, you know, animal welfare benchmarks. There are a ton of benchmarks. However, as with other sustainability categories, I think, don't want to speak for financial institutions, but I think that can get kind of tiresome if there's thousands of them. And while many of them are very great, you know, there is not a one size fits all benchmark for animal welfare, at least as of now, maybe in the future, that assesses all companies and will give you an answer on good or bad. So there are benchmarks that look at particular regions of the world. Maybe they're looking at, you know, the US, maybe they're looking at Europe, maybe they're looking at Latin America, etc. Some of the benchmarks are also looking at a specific industry. So maybe they're looking directly at production, maybe they're looking at procurement within the hospitality industry, etc. So there are definitely some really interesting benchmarks that can support your analysis if you're looking at animal welfare, but I don't think as of now or in the future that will exempt financial institutions from being able to not learn about the topic and just kind of have that one size fits all good versus bad. Yeah, so they exist, but you still have to learn about welfare.
Thank you, Jackie. It's quite similar question for you, Ivan. So, what animal welfare standards do you rely to make sure that investing companies that are compliant with IFC practices and performance standards?
Okay, so I mean, when you look at the animal welfare practices, and I touched upon this in my presentation. We look at all the aspects of the animal welfare, which then results in a good husbandry system end to end. Yeah, and then, as Jackie was saying, there are many standards. Our preference always is to standards that are global or regional. Unfortunately, most of the standards that cover those issues come from the developed countries. Say in UK, you have the red tractor. So the red tractor is a scheme applied there by producers. It is a purely UK scheme, but it's a very good one. So if somebody here in Vietnam wants to apply this one for whatever reason, we would accept it. Yeah. So it has to be something that that is widely used, that is acceptable to us, and that is a regional or global standard. We don't have a list of things that we require. We may hint to what is acceptable. As I said, the global gap for livestock is a good standard, and also we always refer to a standard that can be audited by a third party and is maintained in a manner that that we accept. Yeah? So there are a number of them. Probably in the countries where we invest, there are few unknown that are local.
I actually have a quick follow-up, Ivan. When you're because I know this is a big part of IFC financing, when you're providing financing to other financial institutions, how do you ensure, or at least, try to ensure at any level that they are implementing animal welfare standards? Is that anything that you all can have those discussions with other financial institutions, or what does that look like when you're giving money to a financial institution and then perhaps they then give it to a producer?
Well, I mean, you have to also understand that what the performance standards cover is a lot more than animal welfare. So if in the whole universe of requirements that define what sustainability is, probably animal welfare is a very small portion. So we care about them having a system that takes care of all the aspects of what a performance standards is, and if they have substantial exposure to livestock production, then this may also be interpreted in something around animal welfare. But it's not that we have 200 pages checklist where animal welfare has 5 pages. It's about the capacity of the institution, their policies, their internal system, and so on. And once we have this and we feel comfortable, then it's up to the financial institution to manage it into the details.
Thank you so much. So hope all the financial institutions heard that. It's up to you to manage it. So let us help you.
It's I mean, let's face it, it's a private business. We're just a financier, and all our clients, including financial institutions, they take their decisions. And one of the decisions that they take is to work with somebody that requires more than anybody else, like IFC. So there is a reason why they do this, but they, at the end of the day, they like what they get out of the collaboration with IFC.
I agree, Ivan, but like small step can make something big change, and that's why we are here to have a collaboration with IFC to let the audiences, especially financial institutions, to know that there is the resources that we are able to help them to understand more about farm animal welfare in Southeast Asia or in other side of the world. We don't have much time, so I will invite my colleague, Jackie, to have a final thought before we end the webinar. Jackie?
Thank you so much. So just to wrap things up, farm animal welfare should be an important consideration for financial institutions and investors. If you're currently following IFC standards and practices, it should be part of your approach. If you're not, it should be part of your approach. It's something that can be a material risk for you. And as we've said time and time again, it's the right thing to do. Animals are really suffering, billions and billions of them. Unfortunately, in conversations that we have with financial institutions, like Yvonne said, maybe there are many of you or others that do internally look at animal welfare, but it's missing from your public-facing policy. So in order to really push change forward and make it clear to the market that unsustainable practices and animal cruelty and confinement-based production like cages and crates is not going to be accepted, you have to include these things in your public-facing policies. And we're here to help you. You have the power to make that change, and you can really make an impact in this area. Reach out to us for next steps. I know Yvonne offered IFC as a resource, but let's keep the conversation going and take a stance on this. Thank you so much. Back to you, Yvonne.
Thank you, Jackie. Yvonne, you want to say a final thought and before I end the webinar too? Thank you.
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you to Humane Society International and Johan for inviting me to this webinar. As Jack